yourself for invasion. This is Indie Invasion.
Welcome to Twisted Tales. Tales set in the world of Twisted, a steampunk skirmish game by Demented Games. This is Eric here from Indie Invasion, and today's tale, The Taming, written by Peter Overton and read by our very own Mac.
The Taming. The heavy chain pulled taut as the stonework groaned and cracked, splinters of rock falling from the ceiling of the dank chamber. Oliver was stirring. On the other side of the rusted cell door, the Urkin wrenched open the small hatch and chanced a glance inside, knowing that if the brute spied him, it would almost certainly end in blood. Reassured that Oliver was still shackled within his cell, the Urkin scuttled away to fetch Fagin. Within a minute, so far as time can be measured near a node of the engine, the ragged form of the Urkin returned, trailed by the rat-faced old pickpocket, and the disturbingly sensual metallic slither that heralded the approach of the alchemancer, Nancy. "Have you had any luck controlling young Oliver?" Fagin asked. "Not as yet, Fagin. I've tried a number of formulations, and nothing has had a marked effect," replied the witch in her strange, disembodied voice. Since the incident at the node, Nancy had changed, perhaps more than anyone else. Her gentle, caring nature had been replaced by something ice-sharp and frigid. Her desire to help Fagin's boys had vanished, replaced by a penchant for the mysteries of alchemancy and the seeking of dark things best left undiscovered. Fagin opened the hatch in the cell door and peered into the gloom. At the slight creak of the hinges, there was a great sound. What should have been a human cry was instead a bestial howl, coming from a throat far too young to emit such noises. The old rogue took an involuntary step back as the great iron fetters holding Oliver strained and creaked. Corded shoulder muscles heaved against the relentless metal. Incredibly, the links held, and after a short while, Oliver settled back, scowling at the faces intruding on his insanity. "Hello there, Ollie," Fagin cooed soothingly. "Old Fagin is a-comin' in to have a squiz at you. Be a good lad and all." With that, he carefully slid back the bolts and entered the room. At the doorway, a group of Urkin gathered, one or two carrying pots of steaming gruel earmarked for their evening repast. Fagin motioned one forward and handed him a ring of keys. "Unlock his legs. He looks like he needs a stretch, poor lad." The Urkin crept forwards, taking the rusted keys from the old man's hand. Fearfully, the small creature, once one of Fagin's thieving children, but now twisted by the engine into a gutter-running Urkin, approached Oliver, taking care to stay low and quiet. Fagin turned to another of his twisted boys. "What has you been a-feedin' 'em, lad?" he asked. Nancy's chilling gaze also turned to the nervously shuffling group. The Urkin looked quickly at his companions. "We's been feedin' 'em rats. Big uns." "Rats? Just rats?" queried Fagin. "Yes, boss," piped up another. "We been taking bets on how long they survive. Besides, once we opens the hatch, they just scurries in. Samuel lost his hand last week when we tried cheese with Ollie." Nancy smiled slightly, a cold smile that suggested she enjoyed the idea of the carnage. Fagin frowned. The pickpocketing children, of whom he had once been quite fond, had become something that worried him more than he cared to admit. Still, he mused, they're better thieves than ever. The loot was certainly flowing in. Meanwhile, the terrified Erkin gingerly reached for the locks on Oliver's small, boyish legs. With a speed that, to Fagin's trained eye, surpassed even Dodger's, Oliver reacted. With a metallic shriek and clatter of broken masonry, the chain restraining his left arm gave way, and with a squeal, the Erkin was snatched off his feet. The great block of stone connected to the chain pulled free and swung like a flail, smashing brickwork from the door frame and taking the great iron portal off its hinges, along with the head of an Erkin who'd strayed too close. Nancy laughed and clapped, her tentacled lower half turning her on the spot like a devilish ballerina. The Erkin in Oliver's great metal fist struggled and begged. He'd always been a friend to young Oliver, before the change. That was why Fagin had chosen him to watch over the berserk monster. But it mattered not. There was no room for sentiment in the mind of the twisted Oliver. And with a flick of his wrist, the great steel fingers closed. The Erkins scattered, fleeing headlong into the darkness as Oliver took hold of his remaining restraint with both hands. The wall stood no chance and gave like chalk. Oliver was free. Fagin's eyes widened in dismay as the hulking form stalked towards him, growling like an angered beast. There was malice, there was intent, there would be payback, and if Oliver had his way, there would be blood. Nancy licked her lips in anticipation. As he stepped backward despairingly, Fagin's foot ran into something warm and hard. Glancing down, he saw a fallen pot of gruel at his feet. Before he even had time to think, one of his mechanical arms scooped up the bowl of gray, lumpy broth and deftly spun it across the floor where it twirled to a halt at Oliver's feet. As suddenly as he had sprung to life, the monstrous figure stopped dead, staring at the steaming bowl. With a grunt he sat, lifted the bowl, and began to slurp noisily at the gruel. Panting with relief, Fagin leant on the door, keeping a wary eye on Oliver, who was now emitting a strange, guttural purr. "Well, Nance," he offered breathlessly, "that seems to have done the trick." "Indeed, Fagin, it has," she replied, slithering forwards as she studied both Oliver and the old man with her penetrating glance. "It seems you are something of an alchemancер yourself." With that, she turned her back, and in her strange, sinuous manner, moved away down the corridor. Her voice floated back to Fagin. "One day, you may even be great enough to challenge me." Fagin smiled in the dim light, unsure whether to take Nancy's parting comment as a compliment or a veiled threat. He'd need to be careful, more careful than in the past, more careful than ever before.
Thanks, guys, for listening to today's tales. You can find our Indie Invasion podcast on all podcast platforms, including Podbean, Google, and iTunes. And please visit us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and if you can, support us on Patreon/Indie Invasion. And feel free to email us with any questions or comments at indieinvasion@gmail.com. And remember, guys, don't forget to prepare yourself for the invasion.